This is the recording of the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign discussion on Black liberation and the war in Ukraine. We had some difficulty recording right in the very beginning, so here, this is the recording of the introductions of the two speakers. Claiborne lives in Los Angeles. He is the author of the blog site claysbeach.blogspot.com, which incidentally is banned by Facebook. He is also the director of Vietnam American Holocaust, as well as Linux Beach Productions. He was one of the early users of Twitter, putting it to good use in exposing Assad and exploiting the Arab Spring. Clay has exposed much of the pro-Putin, quote, left, including Code Pink, and he often makes the link between racism and that wing of the left. Clay describes his politics as being communist. He is still a Marxist-Leninist after all these years, although he says he does have some issues with Lenin. Graham Campbell is a long-standing revolutionary socialist Pan-African with a background in trade unionism, anti-racism, and Trotskyism, as well as in the Scottish independence movement. When the Scottish Socialist Party collapsed and split in 2006, Graham briefly joined the British Socialist Workers' Party and was one of the rebels who tried to oppose the sexism and rape apologism of this deeply hierarchical organization. He was a founding member of RS-21, Revolutionary Socialism in the 21st Century, but after Brexit in 2016. He eventually ended up joining the Scottish National Party Socialists, the left-wing think tank with the governing Social Democratic pro-independent Scottish National Party. As a socialist within a broader party, he has been successfully elected to the SNP National Executive Committee as the first Black, Asian, and minority ethnic BME convener, and since 2019 he is a member of the Glasgow City Council. So the actual recording starts a few minutes into the presentation by Graham, and Graham started with showing a video of a song, Only Bad News Coming Out of Africa. However, because of copyright laws, YouTube will not allow us to post that song. So we're going to have to delete it. And if you want to know the lyrics, we're going to post the transcript of the introduction soon.
Okay, folks. So I think you'll see that my reasoning for that song being so important, because I think it encapsulates the 1980s understanding of what was going on at the time. It was the terms of the trade, and as he pointed out, when the hands on the purse strings are white, meaning Western, there was no way that Africa could escape the bonds of slavery that neo-colonialism represents. And if that was true in 1987 when that was done, even more so now. If it was true that then the movements he was talking about, the one-party state in Zimbabwe was arising then, the frontline states were starting to cave into, because of the pressure of apartheid South Africa. The lion he talks about in the first verse is apartheid South Africa. So he's making that point that the movements against those are weakened by the terms of the trade that imperialism sets those countries in their neo-colonial flag independence. But look forward now, right? Where are we? Well, in that UN vote in March last year, 24 African countries abstained in the motion that was prompted by the massacre in Bucha in Ukraine. Very clear massacre by Russian troops occupying a town near to the capital, Kiev. No question about it, absolute proof of it, UN on the ground, investigation on the way, and yet 24 African countries chose to abstain, amongst them some of the countries we're talking about, but also about 9 African countries voted against. And you see that the countries are countries like Eritrea, dictatorships like Eritrea, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and so on. But surprisingly, Ethiopia was there. And that's a very pro-Western country. And yet, because of the recent conflict in Tigray, where the Tigrayans effectively tried to restore their dominance of the Ethiopian state, the Ethiopian Eritrean conflict and the Somalia Horn of Africa region is a classic example of, it's mentioned in this song. There are more tanks than food in the Ogaden Desert. This is the country which shared a border between two of the poorest countries in the world. In the 70s and 80s, were going to war with tanks across a plain where more than 1 million people had starved to death, and yet Moscow was supplying both sides at one time. As they switched sides, the Derg took power in Ethiopia, overthrowing Haile Selassie's kingdom, and then of course they swapped from supporting Siad Barre to supporting the Derg, and suddenly Moscow's efforts are there. Now, why is Moscow there? Moscow wasn't there for beneficent reasons. Normally, people have this folk memory of Moscow being the repository for liberation movements to get their armory. Indeed, that's represented. You see that in the flag of Mozambique. If you look closely at the Mozambique flag and the seal in the top left-hand corner, it's got an AK-47 in it. So iconic is the AK-47 as the Moscow contribution to the armory of African liberation. That's the memory people have. Today in Jamaica, that's where I come from, and people still remember Mugabe fondly as a leader of national liberation of equal standing to Mandela. That nobody sort of seems to remember his massacre of the working class, his massacre of the agricultural economy, his massacre of the farm workers, not just the white plantation owners, but actually massacre of democracy and workers' rights in his country over the last 20 years, as neo-colonial rule has failed to deliver the liberation that Africans fought for, which was land to the people, rights to the workers. So we've got this mythology of national liberation, which is still being used as a sort of anti-colonial trope. You can understand why African leaders today do not want to be told what to do by the Western donors. Indeed, you'll remember that Antony Blinken went there last year as the US Foreign Secretary and visited a lot of these countries that abstained. He went there, and of course they told him in no uncertain terms, "You're not telling us what to do." Quite rightly so. But did they say that to Sergei Lavrov when he was visiting? Well, no. Sergei Lavrov went to Uganda and praised Museveni as to how brilliant he was in being neutral in the question of Ukraine. Of course, this is a country and a state which has been so heavily aided by Western aid, particularly from Western European countries, particularly from America. Most of its schools and hospitals wouldn't operate without those donations because the government is so kleptomaniac and corrupt and has been there for 36 years. And of course, fixed the last election, stopped the entertainer Bobby Wine, who was a popular singer who won the election couple of years back, but they made sure he didn't. He was jailed and his movement was suppressed, rather like Putin, actually, with Navalny. Exactly the same tactics used to wipe out the opposition. You see this all over Africa. These dictators who use elections as a way to stay in power. It's no wonder they have something in common. So what we're dealing here with is Africa being torn between inter-imperialist rivalries, and some of them are choosing sides. Some of them are choosing the oppressive, anti-democratic, just as colonialist as the other side. China wants the resources of Africa too, so does Russia. It's militia, and there's a logical thing with imperialism. When you start exporting your capital, you start building roads and you start lending money to African dictatorships, and then suddenly they then have to pay back those generous loans that you gave them. I'm talking about China here, to countries like Tanzania, Ethiopia, Kenya. You see this all over sub-Saharan Africa. Inevitably, that imperialist money is going to be followed by the desire for military backing of those resources. And China is trying to get military bases. In fact, Antony Blinken visited, I think it was Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, in particular Equatorial Guinea. They're very keen that Equatorial Guinea should not give China a harbor so that they've got an Atlantic, access to the Atlantic. So that's very key. Djibouti is there as a big base for the West as well. Other African countries are part of China's expansionism because China wants to defend its interests like any other imperialist power. Russia, though, as a subordinate country to that process, its only contribution really is the Wagner mercenary. You see this in the way that Mali voted in that. Mali is a country in which the French authorities were desperately trying to help that regime stop the Islamists of ISIS, and weren't getting great success. But at least they they recovered Timbuktu and all the other major towns there. But they were unceremoniously booted out of Mali last year and replaced by Wagner mercenaries. And Mali's new dictatorship, again another military dictatorship, has switched sides and has suddenly been offered $100 million, I think it is, by Putin in food aid. And this is the thing: it's this competitive bidding for the attentions of Africa. I suppose we have to sort of look at the votes as well of the 24 abstaining countries who didn't take Ukraine's side but didn't vote against. Amongst them were included South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya. In fact, all the major African countries, the major economies. And one wonders why those countries would abstain on such a thing when they have such a close historical relationship with Anglophone, America and Britain. And I suppose the obvious thing is that Africa sees itself in many ways quite non-aligned. The non-aligned policy dates from the 60s and 70s, where African countries led by the great Julius Nyerere in Tanzania tried to chart a path where we're not dependent on either camp in the Cold War. That didn't work. And unfortunately, the camps we're now faced with are equally rapacious imperialist powers, but some are led by semi-fascist dictators, and in one case, actual fascist dictatorship, and some are democracy. So Africa does have a choice between this. I think there's clearly a path, and Africa has a price to exact for which side it takes in these things. And you could understand why it does. I should also remember that most of the Caribbean nations, although they're pro-American, they're part of the American sphere of influence, most of them also abstained in that vote, not because they were pro-Russian, but I think they genuinely wanted to be anti-war in the sense of de-escalate the conflict. I think there's clearly an issue that Africans don't see that they have a side in this, but Africa as a continent is more important now economically to the global economy than it ever was. It's got all the core raw materials and minerals for technologies such as cobalt, manganese, all these valuable resources that the Congo Civil War that everybody hasn't noticed, that's been going on for 30 years. 5 million people and counting died, rape used as a weapon of war. That's been an ongoing conflict, which the Rwandan regime, which is very pro-Western, has been involved in looting the neighboring country. And for some reason, how it's possible, but Rwanda is one of the world's leading exporters of cobalt and of manganese, these precious metals, which are not actually in their soil. They're in the Congo's soil, but somehow Rwanda is the one that's selling them abroad. Now, that's only possible because the West backs Rwanda, and those minerals and resources make their way into your mobile phones and technology. And the Congolese people are none the wiser or better off for it. Right now, that war is right there near Goma, the M23 military operation. That guerrilla movement is backed, but is basically Rwanda. That's who it is. Congo was a unique conflict, which many people don't know about, but there are about 6 different African states with their armies there, backed by Russia, China, or America, to loot the resources of the Democratic Republic of Congo. That country did vote for the Ukraine resolution, by the way, because of its own experience of being invaded by its neighbors. So it's interesting that some major African countries did vote with Ukraine, but I think we have a complicated situation, which the fight for African liberation requires Africa really to do 2 things. One, unify under its own steam. There needs to be an African Union with its own currency, its own single market, and a democratic structure for citizens to participate in the way, something similar to what the European Union is. But Africa's struggled to create a system like that. They came close to the beginnings of an African currency at the beginning of 2021. It's been sort of obviously interrupted by COVID. If you look at what the African Parliament does, that it's a very weak institution compared to controlling the dictators, mostly who are in the countries running the governmental side of it. But it's clear that that's where Africa's going, towards a more integrated and more independent economy. And the question is what prices it pays. And the Ukraine war, unfortunately, is part of the collateral in political terms of how these competitions between imperialist powers for influence over Africa go right now. So in terms of what do we stand, what should we be doing? I think clearly for Pan-Africanists the world over, we must not be apologists for dictatorships. We must not be apologists for not recognizing the agency of the African people themselves who want democracy and freedom, who've shown it on the streets, who've had themselves shot off the streets of Uganda, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, all of these countries where they've risen up against these African, elderly dictatorships. I mean, we're all senior years here, but there's no reason why people in their 80s and 90s should be running countries. But when people have, Africa is a country where majority of the population is under 30, as a whole continent, where many countries where the young people are even up to 70% of the population, yet that's not reflected in the leadership of these nations. And similarly, women's disempowerment all over the continent. Very few countries where women are heads of state or prime minister lead anything. While that continues, Africa will still be held back. And Africans the world over will be disrespected by the lack of coherence of our governance, and indeed the lack of coherence of our government's foreign policy. So if you understand where South Africa puts itself, it's rather ironic that this country of all countries should be in an alliance with China, Russia, Brazil and India in the way that it is, when it's an economic weakling in comparison. It's simply, its clear home market is Southern Africa, and integrating that. South African companies are all over and dominating the region over there, particularly around minerals, mining, resources. So in its own right, South Africa is a sort of minor sub-imperialist power in that region. Nigeria is a very interesting country, because it's a country I have family in, 200 million people. It ought to be a very wealthy country, but isn't. Look at Mozambique. Right now, Mozambique, this is a connection to Ukraine, by the way. Mozambique has BP there, British Petroleum. And just last year in November, they signed a deal to ship 3.4 million tons of liquid LNG, liquefied natural gas, which is part of Europe's strategy to wean itself off the dependence on Russian gas. And that's part of, so Mozambique is now part of that European effort. Likewise, other countries have supplied the attempt to get oil and gas from dictatorships like Equatorial Guinea, again, part of the strategy for Europe to seal itself off from the impact of Putin's attempt to use gas and oil as a blackmail weapon. Let me finally say this. As a socialist in Europe, I've always been anti-NATO, anti-nuclear. Scotland is a country that does not want nuclear weapons on its soil. And if NATO is unable to have nuclear weapons 30 miles from where I'm sitting here in Glasgow, then there would be no nuclear submarines in the North Sea, because there's nowhere in England and Wales that these nuclear submarines could be based. But I have to say that lots of the people in this country are shifting their views on the question of NATO and whether Scotland needs to be part of that alliance. Personally, I'm still not in favor of NATO, but I don't see NATO as the aggressor in this conflict. Russia is the aggressor. Russia is the imperialist power that has invaded their neighbor, that has caused genocide, that is actually trying to threaten the security of all of the countries in Eastern Europe and recover its reactionary concept of empire. We understand, we as Africans of all people should understand what reactionary empires are about. We've had French ones, British ones, Portuguese ones, Spanish ones as well. We should understand fully what that means, and we should be instinctively for the right of self-determination against an invading militarist genocidal neighbor. And yet the moral vacuum of leadership you see in Africa is prevalent on the way that you see them voting. The final thing I like to say is on Ukraine and wheat and Russia and wheat. Russia, of course, is looting Ukraine's to export it, while the Ukrainians, of course, a large part of food aid around the world, particularly in the Horn of Africa, was dependent on Ukraine's exports. Now, the Ukraine heroically is still exporting that, with the assistance of Turkey, thankfully, to get from Odessa out to the rest of the world. But Russia is actually stealing the grain from the bits that they have occupied and now handing it to countries like Mali. If that's not colonialism and imperialism, I don't know. It's awful. So we have to understand what we're fighting against and also remember what we're fighting for. For us, Pan-Africanists, Africa and Africans need to be sovereign and self-governing and determining. They have to have agency, and their agency be recognized in the same way that we should recognize the agency of Syrians and Ukrainians. We must not see this conflict solely in terms of how the imperialist powers line up. We must start with the agency, the revolutionary agency of the people themselves.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Graham. And next we will have Clay.
Okay, I would like to start by with some screen sharing myself. If you could turn that on for me and maybe help me get it set up.
There was some difficulty with this screen share, and so we will delete that part.
This meeting is being recorded.
I just got back from San Antonio, and I went there for two purposes. It was a family gathering kind of thing. Stepsister, Renee Claiborne, who was married to my brother, 2 years younger than me, she passed recently, and there was a memorial for her on Friday. There was also the birthday for her mother that was celebrating her 100th birthday. And she was there. I tried to share a picture of her, but I don't know if you were able to see it. But like I said, when I shared it, it cut off my audio, and getting back my audio turned out to be a little bit of a hassle. So anyway, it occurred to me that one of the kind of downsides of living to be 100 might be that you end up doing something no parent ever wants to do, and that is bury your own child. Either that child dies at still a relatively young age, from the point of view of 100 years old, and this woman is still up and about and active, and she needs a walker, but she gets around, and she's in good health relatively. So that is a blessing. Anyway, San Antonio is also the home of Rackspace Hosting. And for almost 6 years, I worked at Rackspace Hosting as a Linux systems administrator. And here's the funny thing. For those 6 years, at least 4 of those 6 years, the last 4, I use Zoom almost every day for video conferencing. So the present problems I'm having using Zoom in the browser as opposed to the app, I've got to sort that out. It's new to me, and I just haven't had time to sort it out. But that's neither here nor there. To get on with this, because I'm not going to try to make any changes or share anything here. I've had a long history in IT. And on the subject of racism and how it pervades our society.
Thank you.
How white supremacy pervades our society. Me, for a long time, I had a gripe which some of the technical terminology used in the IT world. Hello. I'm gonna turn off my screen and I'm feeling distracted by what's going on in front of me on the screen here. So I'm just going to close this and talk to you. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Are you familiar with the terms whitelist and blacklist as it applies to, for instance, firewall rules? Has anybody ever heard those terms? Or do I need to explain them?
No, I haven't heard of them.
Okay. If you work in IT, either as a Linux systems administrator, in network security, any of those things, you deal a lot with firewalls. Are people familiar with what firewalls are?
Yes.
Okay. You have two kinds of firewall rules. One is called whitelisting and the other is called blacklisting. Anybody want to venture a guess at how those two things are defined? And I'll give you a clue, they're diametrically defined. Anybody?
Whitelist is allowed and blacklist isn't?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Whitelist good.
Is a list of IP addresses, domain names, or other characteristics that you want the firewall to deny access to. Well, whitelist is a list of similar characteristics, IP names, domain names, URLs, etc., that you want the firewall to allow access to, even if it would normally block access to it for other reasons. So I always used to be, why do they gotta be named like that? Why do you gotta drag racism into the question like this? Yes, you have to have those two sets of rules. That makes sense. And yes, I had to deal with that terminology every day in my job. And it used to irritate me. Until one day I had an epiphany. I realized that wasn't where the problem lied at all. That it was entirely right and proper that the name of the list of rules of addresses that you wanted to deny access to was named the blacklist, and the name of the list of rules or domains that you wanted to allow access to was named whitelist. That is because the association of white with good and black with bad, white with positive, black with negative, white with security, black with danger is intrinsic to human beings as a species. We're nocturnal. We live on the planet Earth. We get our sustenance from the sun. The sunlight that reaches us is white. White is not really a color in the sense of red, blue, and green, yellow, purple, etc., which all represent individual, say, domains on the electromagnetic spectrum. White is the combination of all those frequencies within, if you understand it in the physics term, within that domain in the electromagnetic spectrum. The screens you are looking at right now are made up of red, green, and blue pixels. There are no white pixels in it. And what you see is white on that screen, what I see is white, is the combination of all those. It is what sunlight looks like when it's reflected by something that fragments. That's why snow is white. That's why sea foam is white. That's why sugar, if it's pure, it's white. That's why a lot of crystalline substance in their pure form are white. The problem never was the association of white with good and black with bad, with white with positive and black with negative. For our species, now for another species that is doctrinal, they might associate safety and security with night. But our species has always been one to retreat to our trees, to our domains, to our caves, to our areas of safety at night, so we can sleep in safety and carry out our activities in what Karl Marx called the natural day. Now, where's the problem coming? I call it the problem of the two definitions of white, and I just gave you one. That's the color definition. And that's been around since human beings invented language and started defining colors. It was one of the first basic things we did with languages, since we see in colors, which not every animal can say, but it's one of the advantages we have in sight. If you look up white in the dictionary, you'll see these two definitions there. One having to do with color and the other having to do with race, having to do with the white race, having to do with white people. That, it turns out, is a relatively recent vintage. That showed up in the Oxford English Dictionary around 1890. No, I'm sorry, around 1690. The first uses of white ever found anywhere was in a play done in England. I think it was in 1613, where the playwright had a man in blackface playing an African king, look out all over the audience. And of course, this was in London, and say, I see all you white people out there. 1613, the earliest reference. And that was kind of an anomaly earlier on. We have to go up to 1650, 1660 in colonial Virginia to start seeing it start being used. In 1660, its first usage in law, I think I should have my notes in front of me, but I won't bother to refer to them now. They're available in a lot of my writings on this subject. Interestingly enough, though, the first uses in law were in laws against intermarriage between Africans, not yet called black, but called Africans, and white or Englishmen. Before white, the Englishmen were referred to as English or Christians, you know, or Europeans, or the various European nationalities that they were. But white was a category, and it was a move that was simultaneous with setting up of African slavery in the colonies. Because before that, they were trying to enslave everybody, basically, through the whole system of indentured servitude. And the earliest Africans brought to Virginia in 1619 as slaves. They were captured as slaves, but they were set into this indentured servitude system. and actually something of a pre-racist America, were among these first Africans to come here. Some of themselves became slave owners or owners of indentured service. They became plantation owners themselves. And when the first racist attacks came, when the first changes came, they were defended by their neighbors, but the changes were inevitable because capitalism was dominant. Capitalism needed a workforce. The indentured servitude thing wasn't working for them. Even though most indentured servants didn't last 2 years, those that made their 5 or 7 years and got their land allotment themselves became farmers and capitalists competing with the other capitalists and plantation owners. Anyway, it's a long story around that, why that wasn't working for them. And they determined that African slavery was going to be the labor force they used. And this inception was the inception of white supremacy. And to make this work for them, they gathered all the Europeans around a color line they created. And they fraudulently, I think this is important to understand, fraudulently took the label white for that cohort of people that they brought together. And the first laws that used white as a label were laws designed to stop Europeans, English, from intermarrying with Africans, because that was going on, and they knew they had to break that up. And their first attempts at that, well, they had some problems. They put a tax on African wives or African women, even though they were married. That didn't apply to English women. Right. And that just resulted in African men marrying English women to save on taxes. It was designed to stop English men from marrying African women because they would be taxed more heavily. And eventually they completely outlawed any intermarriage. And those were the first laws. Those are the first times they used it. And then they used it further and further up until 1705 with the Virginia slave codes. And in that fairly short period, and that round a half a century period, white supremacy was established. And the whole concept of white in the language, and white as a race, and white as a people, and the association of goodness and innocence and all those virtues that had been rightly applied to white since the dawn of language was fraudulently taken by a race to apply to themselves. And I say fraudulently because obviously white people aren't white, like in the color white. When George Washington or whoever said, don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes, nobody came back and said, well, they're white, so how are we going to see the whites of their eyes? Because they're not white, and the whites of their eyes stand out. The whites of their eyes are the same as they are for Black people, for Asians, for Native people, for human beings everywhere, just like all of us, our blood is red. And only what separates us is not white and Black, but the level of melatonin in our skin. Okay, let me get how I associate this with Ukraine. Are you ringing me for something?
We hear you, Clay.
Okay. This is an area I'm very interested in studying. I'm saying this first period when the white race was formed. And I'm sure many of you know that a lot of work has already been done around this. and determine that history and the actual purposeful creation of the white race during this colonial period in Virginia, and then exported to Europe and everywhere else.
Wait, excuse me for interrupting. Just wanted to let you know on the time. It's been a little over 15 minutes.
Okay. So let me get to my key points, how this relates to Ukraine. There was a whole period, and it was setting up the white race initially was not just a question of, here are your privileges and, join the white race. There was a certain amount of violence involved in that and quite a bit of coercion. In fact, my analysis of the first laws that used the word white in them were laws that forced the various Europeans to give up their individual identity as Englishmen or Frenchmen or Germans or whatever, their various national heritages, and adopt the definition of white. Because if you wanted to own land, you had to be white. That is, you had to call yourself white. First, you had to have European heritage and light skin. That is, you had a welcome to the club, but you also had to join the club. And to a greater or lesser degree, give up your former national identity to join this white club. So that has always been a part of racism. The dominant race has not necessarily, been like a voluntary thing. We look at the oppression that is applied to the oppressed races or the oppressed groups and the Black groups. But the domination, the creation of that white group can also be a power play. That was seen in the original part. It was seen, for instance, in Chicago in 1919, in the race riots, where was the Italians versus the African Americans. And there was a growing Polish community that at that time initially had been excluded from the white race. That is, in spite of their European light skin color and all that, they weren't considered white before this. But during the course of this riots, and the Italians decided that they needed to pose as allies. And they did many things because the Poles were like, this is a fight between the African Americans and the white people, and we're neither. And so the Italians even dressed up in blackface and attacked the Poles to convince them that they needed to join with the Italians in fighting the Africans, the Black people in Chicago. And so that's a more recent example. Now I want to give you two other examples, one going on under Hitler and one going on now is my examples. And that's what I call a phenomenon I call a whiter shade of white. And that is for Hitler's really virulent form of white supremacy. Nazism held that not just white people were superior, but among white people, the Aryan people were the most superior. And the Aryan people should rule over all other white people, and then through them, all other people of the world. But they would be at the top of the heap, and racially defined should be at the top of the heap. And so his initial, say, military and political forays were to unite the Aryan people, to reclaim the German people, or to place them under his rule. As the first to, attempting to expand this conquest to the rest of Europe and Russia and beyond. I think we see a similar phenomenon with Putin, and it bears up under the scrutiny of his writings. He sees the Eastern Slavs as the people that are whiter than white, or a whiter shade of white, as you might say, and should rule over everyone else, so forth and so on. His first moves are to unite all the Eastern Slavs, or what he would call the ancient Rus people, under his leadership. But that is not the limits of his interest in conquest. So that similarity he has with Hitler. And that is why, even though the Ukrainian war would seem to be a question of white on white violence, it is seeped and grounded in this history and view of white supremacy, and is part of a long tradition of white supremacy that is rarely talked about and very little studied, and that is violence against white people to make them stay in the white race or to consolidate that white race. It was not entirely done by voluntary methods. And what we see right now in Ukraine is Putin attempting to consolidate his rule over the East, the East Slav people, the Rus people first, by any means necessary. And in this case, obviously very violent. So that is, I think, the fundamental connection between white supremacy and what's happening in Ukraine right now. At first glance, it might not seem to be, so, as we would view a war against, say, a European country against an African country, because it's an inter-Europe war. But whereas the First World War was more an inter-imperialist war, and certainly the Second World War had aspects of that, it also had the Nazi, the fascists, the white supremacist aspect of that, which is where all that comes from. And the important thing to understand about that is white supremacy developed simultaneously with the creation of the white race and with the economic foundation of slavery, which was the economic foundation of the founding of the United States, not just in the South with the cotton trade, but everything attached to that, the manufacturing in the North, the shipping in the North, the banking in New York, everything that had that foundation of slavery. That provided the material basis for a powerful ideology, a well-grounded ideology that has spun off many derivatives since then. Do not stand it as equal because they are derivatives of it and not independent from it in any way. Anyway, I'm probably over my time now. And I'll see if I can bring back the Zoom thing. All right, yeah. So where am I on time now, John?
Let's see. You've been a little over 25 minutes.
Okay. Should I stop now, or I did have a piece I wanted to read on white supremacy in Russia.
If you could just make some concluding points, the piece that you wanted to read you'll have some time also at the end of this meeting to speak. So it's up to you how you want to deal with that.
Okay, well, let me just make a few concluding points. Okay, in conclusion, this is my thesis. Putin is representative of a version of great white Russian chauvinism, which is itself a derivative of white supremacy that envisions the Rus people, East Slavs, as the superior race destined to rule the world, or at very least a large part of it. They see their first task as uniting all Rus people under Putin's leadership. This is in preparation for the greater conquest in Europe and beyond. The ready-made excuse for these military incursions and annexations is the protection of the Russian diaspora. In the cases where the various Rus people have adopted different national identities, language, and/or state organizations, these must be eradicated so that the people can be absorbed into the greater Rus people. Hence the genocidal nature of such campaigns. Seen from this perspective, the Russian-Ukrainian war may be seen mainly as the struggle of white people, white-on-white violence, but it definitely has racist motivations. We've been through this movie before. The last time was in the 1930s when Hitler and the Nazis took initial steps to unite all German people, the Aryans, his master race, before embarking on a course of violent world conquest. So that would be my summation.
Okay. Well, thanks very, very much for your comments, Clay, and also thanks again to Graham. So I see we have one person who wants to speak, Simon. So if speakers could limit themselves to about 2 to 3 minutes. So
yeah,
okay. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'll try to be very, very brief. I just want a quick comment to what Graham said. It was actually a great speech, linking the struggles in the African countries to those also in Ukraine. I would just say, you said about the Wagner group, and I would say you're seeing it as a mercenary group, which is still not so much present in Africa like the Chinese imperialism, but I think we can now say that it's gaining traction because it's not just Mali, it's also Burkina Faso, for example, where we had again the military junta, which is switching to Russia. They had the role in Mozambique in fighting the Islamist rebellion in the south of Mozambique as well. They are present in Sudan. If you see, for example, the communist parties in around the world are mostly campist in the terms of what as they see Russia. But there was few examples of the parties from this tradition that were more critical of the Russian attack on Ukraine, and one of them was the CP of Sudan, and I think it's because of the situation in that country also. But I would, if we are talking about Ukraine today, I would also want to link it more with the country we are talking about, because in the context of Black people and people of color in general, there are few important themes which are worth mentioning about Ukraine. It's, for example, in that context, we have the Ukrainian Koreans, which are more visible. Some of you know, some of you maybe don't. But for example, the governor of Mykolaiv, Vitaly Kim, is Ukrainian, is Korean-Ukrainian. There is a group called Tożsamość in Ukraine, which is very visible in the internet now, which is organized by Ukrainian people of color, women and men from Nigeria, Ethiopia, Kazakhstan, living in Ukraine, which fight with this presenting Ukraine as a Nazi country in Russian propaganda. There is the Ukraine has a black MP. Some of you know, some of you might not know it. From 219, Jean Bielanik is the first Ukrainian MP. We have prominent Afghans or Roma people fighting in Ukrainian army, and particularly Roma is interesting because in the Eastern Europe, it should be noted that the Roma people were like in the US, we talked about anti-blackness. In Eastern Europe, we can talk about the anti-blackness in the context of Roma people also. I think it's an interesting theme, maybe not for this discussion, but just to mention it. There is the Twitter activity of Alexander Polanichev, who writes about Russian colonialism, including slavery during the Tsarist era, for example. We can have like multiple examples of this kind of discussions. And I just want to mention it in the context of Ukraine because I think it's particularly interesting to have the voices of people of color, black and people of color in Ukraine also, which are present and visible also in the Anglosphere. You can easily find it. So that's just my comment. And some small business to Graham because he's an elected representative. If we can talk after the meeting, I have one thing I want to talk to you about, or we can contact by email. That's all for me. Yeah.
Thank you, Simon. Linda.
Yeah. Let's see. Oh, okay, I'm muted. Yeah, I have some comments for Clay. One of the things about IT is that a lot of IT that we work on today was actually created by women. There was a woman in 1700s France who actually created the idea of I can't remember her name, but she shows up in crossword puzzles all the time. But she actually invented a lot of the ideas behind coding and data. But during the World War II, African American women contributed to NASA and other IT projects, because back then it was considered a clerical job. It was coding and all this other stuff, and then all of a sudden it wasn't very well paid or anything like that. So that you had all these great women mathematicians that got hired to do this job because it was considered women's work. But then in the 90s, it's all of a sudden IT work became the province of geniuses, and only really smart people could do it. So it became, we now have the bias against people of color and women in IT because it's considered, the status of the job changed. And the other thing is that a lot of the war that's going on in Ukraine and elsewhere with Russia revolves around IT, around misinformation, disinformation, hacking, other stuff with attacking people's voting machines and infrastructure, not attacking the infrastructure not just with missiles but with cyber attacks. And I know Clay's done a lot of stuff to try and make IT accessible to all people, and it's really becoming a struggle for all people to master IT and continue this fight against fascism and Russia in particular. That's all I have to say.
Thanks, Linda. Before I call on Clay, is there anybody else that wants to speak? I have some comments that I'd like to make, but well, go ahead, Clay. Don't forget, you'll have some time right at the end of the meeting also.
Okay. This is in reference to what Simon was talking about, and this is from the selection I wanted to read anyway. It said, I'll just read this one paragraph. It says, in other words, Tajiks and Uzbeks, even if they are legal Russian citizens, are not considered real Russians. In Putin's Russia, being a real Russian or Russia means being Slav or white rather than possessing the status of a legal Russian citizen. These real ethnic Russians, who make up 80% of the population, called ethnic minority or others, Korami or Black, a term which isn't confined to those of African descent, but apply to everyone in non-Islamic populations. They also use derogatory terms such as shuruka, which literally means block of wood and signifies being stupid. Most of these quote unquote Black people work in the country's twilight economy, which is not regulated. They typically earn only 40% of what white ethnic Russians would make performing the same job. So it goes to your point. I think my point is too, is that white and Black as defined in races, really it has little or nothing to do with actual color. You know, it has to do with economic status and all of that, and defining the other, or whether you're in the in crowd or the out crowd, you know. And it's only roughly related to color because the oppressed people are darker than the European people that came out on top when capitalism first emerged. So I just want to make that point on that. In terms of Linda, what you're talking about, I'm kind of really familiar with the more recent history, like the past 50 years of IT industry and the role of women and Blacks there, because I've been very much involved in that. And we could go into that in a lot of detail in some time, particularly, you know, the role of minorities and women struggling, and the role of the open source community in the community, and really pushing a lot of people like that to the forefront. That's one of the things I really loved about Rackspace, for example. They had a lot of women in high positions. They had a lot of other nationalities working there compared to a lot of other institutions. But that was a direct result of them coming out of the open source community and the revolutionary technology and culture that came out of that. But that's a whole, you know, that's a whole nother area. But yeah, I appreciate your identifying that and the history women have played in that for a long time.
Thanks, Clay. Talmadge?
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Clay, for your comments, and also Graham for his excellent analysis of Africa. I also wanted to extend that analysis a little further to talk about Latin America, and in fact, how in places like Nicaragua, where you have discrimination against the Mesquite Indians, or even in Mexico, where you have heavy discrimination against darker skinned folks in Chiapas, and even Nahuatl Indians that live in like Michoacan and places like that. The racist tendencies are worldwide. They're not confined, obviously, to the US or even to Europe and Africa. But and I think the point here is that how do we overcome, how do we struggle to transcend the marginalization of whole bodies of people? And I think Clay pointed out well that are there not just because of the color of their skin, but because the color of their skin has been leveraged as a vehicle to discriminate by white supremacy and white supremacist policies on a worldwide basis, right? And I think that the point was made well that in Europe, for example, the Roma, who look in many cases like other people in Italy and elsewhere, have been heavily discriminated against for centuries as marginalized people, and still are. In fact, Albanians are discriminated against by the Italians. So there's a long trajectory and history of this, and not to mention we haven't even touched on anti-Semitism, which is a whole nother ballgame with this process. But I do believe that if we're going to try to do a integrated struggle that really grapples with the issue of race, class, gender, religion, etc., it has to be one that posits a universal context of what it means to be human, in a way that's beneficial to all folks. And that, as we know, that means not just anti-imperialism, it means an internationalist perspective, which is why I'm in this group. And it also means one that prides itself on a distribution of resources on an equitable basis to everyone, not just a few. I just wanted to make a few comments, but I think that it's important to see this in the struggles around, neocolonialism in Africa, but also neocolonialism in Latin America, and even other countries as well, because I think it affects how folks perceive the Ukrainian-Russian struggle. But clearly, I think Clay's point is important to know that the whole idea of the Novorussian policies of Putin are ones that, in fact, have created this dilemma that we're all in the middle of assuming that somehow he can revive the Tsarist empire on the basis of a delusion. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Talmadge. I'd like to make a point in the first place, what Clay was pointing out, that when we think of racism, is not just simply white against, or black and white. And that leads to the whole issue of national and ethnic and cultural divisions. And it's something I've been reading about over the last month or so. And when you look at that whole region of Eastern Europe, the Transcaucasian region, and also the Baltic states, that entire region. And when you think about how those nations were developed, and in some ways is no different from Africa or what we call the Middle East, which is really North Africa and Western Asia. Really, the poster child for how those nations were defined was the Sykes-Picot Accord, where the British and the French got together and decided which parts of that region they would get to suck the blood and the oil out of. And they drew up the borders. And when you look at that whole region of Eastern Europe, it's the exact same thing. And also in that region, because it experienced invasions of one imperial power after another, the Ottomans, going all the way back to Genghis Khan, the Ottomans, the Persian Empire and Russian Empire and so on, then all of the different peoples are extremely mixed in together. Like I was reading about in Estonia, there's regions of Estonia where the Estonians are a very small minority. And it's the same thing everywhere. And so the whole, and if you look at Africa, how is it any different? And so the whole issue of national self-determination gets all mixed up with the issues of national and ethnic and also religious tensions. And when you look at that history, and I would bet it's the same thing in Africa, but in Eastern Europe, when you look at that history, you can see, for instance, in what's now Armenia and Azerbaijan, how the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis lived together and for whole extended periods got along great. And actually you could see the two cultures were starting to merge. And then came one imperialist crisis or another. And that was expressed through actual wars between these two groups. That tendency to merge then was torn apart. And so I think that we have to think a lot more about this whole issue. I just want to say about Africa and like a Pan-African Federation, I mean, it's something that the South American capitalist countries are trying to do, but I don't see how it's possible, because inevitably they're going to be dominated by one imperialist power or another, or the rivalries between the different imperialist powers. So I don't see how it's possible within capitalism, as opposed to a socialist federation. So those are my comments. Bradley?
Yeah, thanks. To both Graham and Clay for their, what I see as very complimentary presentations. I just want to focus in on the one, I think, immediate problem that we face, which is the fact that the Eurozone, the EU, has very different policies. And by the way, also the UK, when it comes to political, what are essentially refugees, migrant refugees from different areas of the world. And the problem, the apparent problem, is that the Eurozone seems to be making it easier for refugees from Ukraine to enter the Eurozone than it is for other such refugees, with the most extreme case being the UK, where at present the PM, nominally a so-called person of color, Rishi Sunak, is now threatening to take the UK out of some international corridor migrants so that they can more people of color in the English Channel, which is essentially what they're doing. Okay. So obviously this would be used by our political opponents in the pro-Putin camp to appeal to the global, so-called global South, in order to discourage solidarity with Ukraine. And, you know, speaking for myself, it really needs further analysis and further understanding of how we can address this. But one quick thought is simply to emphasize over and over again that the Putin regime's project for Ukraine is in fact neo-colonial. And we should direct any objections to Ukraine solidarity based upon the racism of the Eurozone, okay, to that as a fact. So I just wanted to put that up there as a practical issue that Ukraine solidarity will have to deal with on a continuing basis now and in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Bradley. Cheryl?
Yeah, sorry I had to sign in late due to a family medical situation, and I missed Graham's presentation, but I'm really glad it was recorded, and I look forward to watching it. I wanted to talk about the complexities of, well, we could call it, I think intersectionality is the right word, about how for a long time now in the left, including the socialist left, there is really no talk of class, or if there is, it's just another category. It's, race, ethnicity, gender, and then class. So how this is played out in regards to Ukraine is that, we know that the Putinists have used the race card. So we know of anecdotal stories through friends and activists where someone has been involved in a collective or some kind of political organization, and it might be even a person of color who said, we really should do something to defend the Ukrainian people's right to self-determination and defend themselves, and they'll be accused of being a racist because they're defending alleged white people. This is true, and it's absolutely horrendous. And of course, it's not just in relationship to Ukraine, but in this moment, it is really problematic. And for anybody that has looked into or might have been online during the People's Forum, looked into the People's Forum in New York City or UNAC, and as Megan has pointed out to us, that in Code Pink as well, that there was a time, particularly the I guess it's the executive board, I don't even know, the leadership of Code Pink was primarily white people and white women, but they figured out that they needed to use the race and ethnicity card, And so now their entire leadership is a broad spectrum of somebody from every category and intersectionality. And the same thing is also true with the People's Forum. And I think their director is a man named Manolo. And, he's a mixed race. He's a Black man with also a Caribbean background, I think. I forget where he's from. But in any case, and this is held up as, the revolutionary identity, not to be challenged. So, and it's playing an absolutely horrendous divisive role in the building of an international, a truly internationalist solidarity movement, whether it's for Ukraine or any other countries. So, and yesterday, so I went to a really fascinating event. It was an event for Black Heritage Month, and it was an event about the culture of resistance in slave communities in the Georgia Sea Islands. It was very, very powerful. I was very moved by it. I learned a lot. But so at the end, they allowed people to ask questions, and I stood up and I asked a couple of questions. And my friend that I went with, who is African-American Latina, told me later, she said, when you should introduce yourself as telling them that you have Mexican blood, because people accept me. I do have Mexican blood. My grandmother was Mexican. So, but that's how it's really, like, if you just present as white, like, you might as well just leave the room. In any case, these are things that are part of the challenge that we face now in terms of building international solidarity.
Thanks, Cheryl. Is there anybody else that would like to speak? If not, okay, Simon, you've already spoken, but yeah, go ahead and speak.
Yeah, I know. I'm gonna be very brief. Just a small clarification you said about Estonia. Actually, when you're talking about Estonia and the Estonians as minority, it's actually a history of Russian colonialism, because minority in many cities, like in Tartu, is Russian, and it's not because they were the traditional minority in Estonia, but because of the history of the Soviet Union and Russia. So we have to remember that as a fact. And because Talmage was saying about Latin America, so I would say we can do some business here. I would recommend going to the global meeting you're organizing as the European Network in Solidarity with Ukraine, but also other groups from other continents. I'm just putting the link in the chat. It's going to be focused on Latin America this time. We're going to have speakers from Brazil, maybe even the Secretary General of the PSOL from Brazil, quite a large left party from Brazil, about Ukraine solidarity in that context, in that country, in that region. So if you want to take part, feel free to register. I just put it in the chat, and that's all.
Thanks. If there's nobody else, then we'll move to close the meeting. But before Clay speaks, I just want to make one other comment about Estonia, because it shows how complex the issue is. Because its border with Latvia was drawn up by the governments of Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union. And among other things, it meant that the Lithuanians on one side of the border had to, and there was a large Lithuanian population, they had to either move or learn Estonian. A lot of them didn't speak Estonian. And also, you had a large ethnic German population. But it's not just Estonia. If you look at all the countries of that entire region, you have whole enclaves of people from all different, people who were Turkish or Ottoman origins. And so it's all totally, or look at the Tatars and how they were the population in Crimea. Now they're a small minority, even before 2014. So So it's just a very complex situation is what I'm trying to say. So with that, maybe we can move to wind up the meeting, and Clay has his hand up. So maybe Clay, you could go ahead and speak, and then Graham, if you have any responses to this discussion and any concluding remarks, you can go ahead. So with that, go ahead, Clay, please.
Cheryl, I think the point of my presentation is when you present yourself as white, already you present yourself as superior. It's inherent in that label, and it can't be separated from that label. You know, white supremacy is really part and parcel of a certain people labeling themselves white, and you can't separate it from that.
Would you like to make any further comments just about any other parts of the discussion, or sum up your?
I'll kind of just leave it at that, because that's a core thing that I'm trying to get across. Okay. There's this tie between the definition of a certain group of people as white historically and white supremacy that is immutable, irrevocable, based in our primal understanding of the world. Before the concept of race even came about, before we were even human, when we were just primates, when we were just daytime dwelling mammals, daylight meant something, darkness meant something else. Those are inherent qualities in our being. So when a certain group of people fraudulently, because they are not white, you see a white cat, a white cow, a white horse, and you know, well, we call that a white cat, a white horse. You see a person that calls himself white, and you say, what the hell? How did that come about? And when did that come about? Well, we know it came about with the advent of African slavery. It came about a good, I would say 20, 25 years before the literature started referring to Africans as black even. And it was a deliberate thing done to oppress a certain people and to divide the working class. And it cannot be separated from that. So when you present yourself as white and call for unity, be aware of the problem that's inherent in that. That'll be my summation.
Thanks. Rick, it's a little difficult to bring somebody in at this point, but if you feel like you absolutely have to comment, go ahead.
We're dealing with two categories. One is the natural world, light and darkness, and the other one is our social constructs. And I think that's what we really must emphasize, the social constructs. Race is a social construct. Gender is a social construct. Nationalism is a social construct. And we struggle against all these social constructs on a class basis to unite the working class for liberation. That's it.
Thank you, Rick. If there's nothing further, then we're going to ask Graham to sum up, and then I have a couple of concluding announcements. Go ahead, Graham.
Firstly, thank you, John. And firstly, thank you, Clay and comrades, for all the excellent contributions and interesting, thought-provoking interventions. I'm going to start by agreeing with Rick that, in fact, yes, these are social constructs, but one obvious point about a social construct, like, for example, the Scottish national movement, what Scotland is, the key point in a national movement like mine is whether it's defined ethnocentrically or by citizenship and identification with rights. And very, very deliberately, the Scottish national movement has been defined non-ethnocentrically. And as a London-born African Caribbean person who lives in its largest city, I'm representing as an elected representative from a political party that is left of center, social democratic, and decidedly not ethnocentric. Now, globally, nationalism in quotes is generally understood as ethnocentric, racially exceptionist, and all of that stuff. And that's an identity that's profoundly rejected within the body politic that I exist in. And what's interesting when I compare that Scottish experience, which has welcomed refugees, and that point that I think it was Bradley brought up earlier about European migrants, accepting migrants from the Syrian, Afghan, indeed the Congolese, Kosovan, all the other wars that we've had in Europe. They've been welcomed by the most part within Scottish and British society, as they have been in Germany, France, and in most of the big European countries. And particularly it was interesting in 2015 when the Syrian conflict was on, when the borders were suddenly opened by Europe. But Britain's always had a sort of fortress island sort of to keep refugees out. But despite those hefty measures, and you can date this from since Tony Blair and Thatcher's time, every year of my life, whichever government's been in power has introduced new asylum legislation or border legislation to restrict so-called illegal immigration. And every year it's failed miserably, because actually the wars that happen overwhelm and supersede those attempts to hold the barriers up. So the irony is, of course, in Britain, is that while we have an Asian prime minister, first ever non-white prime minister, well, no, not the first ever. You could argue that Disraeli was the first ethnic prime minister in Britain, but there's a man whose family would be kept out by the laws that he's currently implementing, but yet he is not able to stop the flow, because the problem we have in Britain is that we don't have a legal way of getting here. When you press them on, well, how do you stop the boats crossing the channel? Well, there's no legal safe route. The people who are from Afghanistan, Iraq, and all the other countries like Syria, who are currently camping out at Calais, unable to join their families who've got refugee status in Britain, people who are, in other words, people who are totally entitled to apply for safe passage to Britain because they have family connections, are unable to come because there's no legal way to get here. But cue the Ukraine war, and suddenly, in Scotland alone, 120,000 Ukrainians have legally come where a safe route has been found. Most of the ones that I've met have come either from Warsaw or from Paris, because the British government have made legal, safe arrangements to travel. And that's the point. This is the racism here, is that justifiably they have made provision for Ukrainians to come to seek refuge, and they have had mass popular support. Many people have opened their homes up. There's about 100,000 who are accommodated in people's homes in Scotland. Just people, ordinary people, just welcoming them. Unfortunately, they did not do that for Afghans, Syrians, Africans, and everybody else who needed to flee war and persecution. And that indicates that people in Europe obviously identify racially and nationally with the plight of Ukrainian Europeans, partly because the Ukrainians are, of course, portrayed themselves as Europeans, as people fighting for Western values and Western civilization, all that nonsense. That may be true. They genuinely believe that. I had that conversation with Ukrainian students on Friday night at the Glasgow University group for Ukrainian students. So they genuinely believe they're defending democratic values, and to a large extent they are. They're at the front line of the fight against authoritarian, genocidal, racist dictatorship. I mean, let's be clear about this. When people say to you, oh, well, what about the racism, the whataboutery, as we call it? What about the racism of Europe? What about the racism of just about everybody else, including my own country? But let's ignore the racism that's leading to the actual deaths, massacre, murder, and fleeing of the population of Ukraine. The people who are peaceniks in this, and I include your pink folks over in the States, who want simply to stop the war without stopping the injustice that's happening to Ukrainians, are basically asking those Ukrainians to submit to occupation, to become Russians by force, to have their Russian education and propaganda, Putin's education curriculum, rammed down their children's throats, their men to be forcibly conscripted into the Russian and DPR, LNR armed forces, as they currently are being, all being deported into Russia. Something like 200,000 civilians are still missing from Ukraine inside Russia, many of them deported Stalin style to cities far, 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 far away from Ukraine. Those people are essentially kidnapped people. the Crimean Tatars have been deported again from their home territory for about the 4th time in the last 100 years. Putin's really following Stalin here, not Peter the Great. So this is the kind of racist genocidalness, which of course is complicated by the racism we have internally within our society, institutional structural racism, which, Clay's quite right. It has its historical origins in the slave codes of Barbados and the British West Indian Islands, which they codified the racial discrimination against African people being chattel. And that's where you Americans unfortunately get it from, because of course I, as a Scot and Caribbean person here, we have to claim our responsibility for giving you that racial code and those racial institutional structures, and that these exist in international politics. But I've also, had to cope with the nonsense about Russia fighting Nazi fascism in Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine is led by a Jewish president, a member of his top 10 team of candidates in his election as in servants of the people when they won the elections in 2019 is in fact this Jan Beleniuk, who's a Ukrainian wrestler, who's one of his top 10 listed people. So there's a black wrestler who is half Ugandan, who is one of the top people in servants of the people's electoral list. This is supposedly a fascist state, while the Russian regime, which is led by actual fascists, people like Strelikov and so on, across the border, Russian National Unity, long-standing fascist organization, they're people at the heart of the Novorossiya ideology, and they're the people who invaded Ukraine in 2014 from the east. So I've been to Russia twice myself, right? And from the early days of Putin's regime, the anti-Semitism that was growing, the authoritarianism, the attack on democratically elected officers, he abolished the democratically elected governors, he appointed governors after that point, he implemented a labor code which smashed labor and trade union rights when they were resisting the oligarchical privatization. What he was trying to crush in Ukraine was the good example of a population which had made 3 political revolutions against oligarchy and against corruption and anti-democratic attempts to create a Putin-style dictatorship. Of course, he didn't want an example like that living and breathing next door to Russia in case the Russians people themselves got that bright idea, and of course many of them did, and they tried to express that through the Navalny movement, and of course what did he do? He crushed them off the streets. I have to say, having protested on the streets of Moscow myself, I haven't suffered quite to that degree, but the fact that you had any kind of demonstration, the police's first presumption was that you weren't allowed to do it. That was in 2002. So of course in the years since then, it's become pretty much impossible to do what I did in 2002, which is come up to a demonstration with rail workers and do that. So that's the kind of regime we're dealing with. Anybody who is an apologist for that regime is an apologist for people having their civil rights removed, having their existence even denied, having the Ukrainian people wiped out as people, and also for working class people to be suppressed and held in a dictatorship forevermore. That's what they're for. They're not for peace, they're for dictatorship. And that we should call them out morally and politically for what that stance means. There is no way that the Ukrainians can defend themselves without weapons and without pursuing the war till Putin's forces are gone from their territory. Anything less is frankly meaningless and would be laughed at by Ukrainians if it wasn't so sad. Because it essentially, how can you say you're for their rights, but without them being able to exercise their rights in practice? Now, sadly, the international socialist working class forces do not have a military armed force at their disposal. They don't have tanks, planes, bombs, all the things you need to missiles to defend yourself from a military invasion of a superpower. If we are serious about supporting Ukraine, you have to be in favor of their victory. And this is a difficult thing for us, particularly as an anti-war activist. I was there as an activist against the Iraq war and everything that stood for. Clearly, I'm opposed to imperialist expansion. Frankly, I'm opposed to NATO imperialist expansion. But NATO is not to blame for this conflict. Russia, Putin, is to blame for this conflict, and we should put the blame where it lies. And in terms of the understanding of race, class, and immigration, yes, that we can expose the facts as activists and things we've done in Glasgow. In fact, we made sure in the first Ukraine demos last year that refugees from Afghanistan, from Africa, were on the platform with the Ukrainians, showing their solidarity, but making that point about racism and the way the unequal treatment. But the point is that you can have that debate because the government showed that they could create legal, safe corridors for refugees from Ukraine. If they can do that for white Europeans, they can do that for everybody else. And that's the way for us to tackle that question. They should do it for Ukrainians. They should do it for Syrians. They should have done it for all the other peoples who needed that respite from persecution and dictatorship. But in the end, the answer has to be the defeat of dictatorship. We are in the early stages of, I suppose, a war between the democracies and the authoritarian regimes. And I don't think you can really be neutral on those things. You're either for an authoritarian form of state capitalism, a la China and Russia, etc., becoming the dominant power in the world, or with all of its flaws, you fight for democracy and freedom from where we are able to fight from. I think it's Ukrainians have deep illusions in the progressive nature of Europe and of NATO, and you can understand why. But the fact that countries like Sweden are pushing, having been neutral, and now pushing to join NATO, indicates that they see the threat from Russian imperialism as much more serious than maybe we've seen it before. It's shifting views, and it makes it a much harder task to argue against NATO's nuclear armed than it was before. But that doesn't mean that we should not back the Ukrainians. We still have a duty to back the right of self-determination, back the right of existence against a racist, imperialist, genocidal, maniacal, armed imperialist state.
Okay, thanks very much, Graham. And so, Clay, I see you want to make. You have just a couple more concluding comments you'd like to make, and then I have a couple of announcements.
Okay. Just a couple of responses to Graham. If you have information that cites the formation of the white race, either in law or literature or a social phenomenon that places it in the Caribbean before Virginia in that period between 1850, 1816, and 1705, I would be very, very interested in seeing that. Because notwithstanding the role that the Spanish and the Portuguese played, and the English also, in terms of instituting African slavery and utilizing African slavery in Mexico, in the Caribbean, in other areas as I understand it, the actual formation of the white race as such took place specifically in Virginia and specifically in a certain period which can be identified. And first uses of the term white as applied to people in dictionaries, in law, in literature can also be identified to establish that. And I think it's important to do because with regard to what existed before, say what existed in 1619 in Virginia, in that period was not white supremacy as we classically know it now. White supremacy as it developed in that full form in that same area in the next, say, 100 years or even the next 80 years, or even more specifically in the period between 1650 and 1705. Because that is the form of white supremacy that has become dominant throughout the world and spawned all kinds of other things. And yes, it's very much related to class and capitalism because that is also the period where capitalism first developed. And it developed lockstep on this planet with white supremacy. The other thing I wanted to say is regards to how immigrants from or refugees from Ukraine have been treated as to refugees from Africa and the Middle East. It's true that racism played a role in that, and the Ukrainians getting preferred treatment. But we shouldn't also neglect the fact that That's not the only reason, but there are two sides to that. First place, it was a war in Europe, and people were fleeing directly across the border from a war zone, as opposed to a few borders removed. And that's a factor that has nothing to do with race or nationality. That's just a fact of geography. And so that shouldn't be discounted. The other thing is, in my eyes, the Ukrainians haven't received all that much preferred treatment that should be bragged about. Yes, initially they got a lot of attention in the first month of the war or so. And that's when people complained most loudly they were getting preferred treatment. But since then, it's hard to see that much in terms of preferred treatment. Particularly here in the United States, what did Biden say, less than 100,000 to 80,000, provided they had family members here already? I thought that was pitiful, not something to brag about. You know, yes, it's worse for people coming across from Mexico, right, being treated right now like that, or from, you know, from Haiti or from Africa. But all across the board, we're not doing what we should be doing. We're certainly not doing it, to mention one other thing, for the people of the earthquake in Turkey and in Syria. And right now, my mind and heart is really with them. And the fact that people are dying even while we're meeting. And a lot more could be done to dig them out of the rubble than the world is doing. So I'll end with that comment.
All right. Thanks very much for those points, and especially mentioning the earthquake, which we really should be aware of. With that, I'd like to conclude with some final announcements. First of all, again, I want to thank Graham and Clay, and I also want to apologize to you two for harassing you about registering for the meeting. I was having a problem with Zoom at the time, and from what I was seeing, you weren't registered when you were. So again, I want to apologize to you for that. Our next public meeting will be on February 26th. And apropos of what Clay just mentioned, which I'm sure will come into the discussion, it will be with Rama Kordimi, who is a Syrian activist. And of course, she'll be talking about the war there, but I'm imagining she will also be talking about the, in relation to the earthquake. And we will be sending out an announcement on that soon. Also, I'm posting something on the list, on the chat. We recently put out a public statement urging people to boycott this pro-Putin Rage Against the War Machine event in Washington, D.C. And anybody that would like to sign it, including, of course, people outside of the United States, we would love you to do so. You see the link there.